Welcome to the first ever Expansive Education webinar. We're delighted to be talking to you today, and our topic is going to be the vexed issue of character education, what it is, why it matters, and a number of other issues about how we develop it, and possibly even, we've already had one question, how we might assess it. My name is Bill Lucas. I'm Professor of Learning here at the University of Winchester, one of a network of universities and partners who all together make up the Expansive Education Network. If you tweet, you can see in a moment from my screen, which is about to appear, that you might like to use the @eedNET title or @LucasLearn if you'd like to follow this conversation later on. I wear a number of affiliations, and today, apart from the Expansive Education Network, I'm really delighted that the Comino Foundation, our supporters in this, are part of the conversation, and also from the other side of the world, the Mitchell Institute in Melbourne. So let's begin. What is character education? Well, it's much in the news at the moment. The last Secretary of State for Education in England was beginning to talk about it as if it was something she genuinely cared about. In the last 5 years, there have been a number of grants made to schools and to other organisations working with schools to explore character education in practice. For some teachers, it feels like something else to do, possibly a suspiciously friendly carpet in the middle of a forest, a bear trap that you might fall into, something else that you've been asked to do. And I think it might well be a bear trap if we think about character education in the same way that we think about geography or maths or science, because as we're going to discover, it's rather different to that. If you think about schools, and if you think about the kind of things we want young people to have by the time they leave schools, if you like the desired outcomes of all of that learning, there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of things that are going on in this field of character. The first is what many people out there who aren't teachers would associate with character. That's to say, all the things that are about moral values, the right and wrong of what you do in your life and at school. And the second list, and I'm going to be focusing slightly more on these, is a list of things which are all about your attitudes to learning. Whether or not your attitudes to learning and to knowledge is the kind of thing that's going to help you get on, not just at school, but in life. If you like, there's a pro-social set to do with moral values, and there's an epistemic set to do with our attitudes toward learning. And you'll recognize some of the words on that slide. That we might want our young people to be kind and generous and forgiving and tolerant and trustworthy, brave sometimes too, convivial, that's to say, not just thinking about self, but thinking about all the other things they can do with teams, and on a planet where there isn't enough to go round, ecological as opposed to rapacious. Now look at the other list, that list on the right-hand side of the screen, and you'll see they're a slightly different set of ideas. They relate to the first group, because if you're curious and inquisitive, that may make you, frankly, a more fun person to have around. If you're the kind of person who's resilient, who doesn't give up and get easily defeated, likewise. You're the kind of person who might be welcomed in any team, in any group, in any choir, in any sports group, in any family, frankly, and so on. You can see the kind of words that are on that list. This is taken from a booklet that my colleague Guy Claxton and I produced for the SSAT, where we asked this bigger question: what kind of teaching for what kind of learning? And when we talk about character, we can't not talk about what kind of learning. What do we want? What's the point of school? And that's the kind of thing that we're going to be exploring. It would be possible to consider that character and character education are somehow new. Possibly, I've heard it said that these are progressive ideas. If you don't like them, perhaps they're dangerous ideas. If you do like them, perhaps they're the main focus of what you do as a teacher. There's nothing new about character. Here's a book from the latter year of the 19th century in North America and Canada. Just look at that list of words on the cover. This is a book about character power, and you've got some of our current words of the day. Words like grit, much associated with the work of, for example, Angela Duckworth. You've got words like adaptability. That seems a very modern term, doesn't it? In fact, if you look at the OECD, you can see that adaptability is now what our policymakers say is the most important thing that schools and universities can and colleges can produce in young people. So taken together, there's a set of things there. You can see virtue and honor and fidelity and courage up at the top. And, oh, by the way, there is a slightly curious one at the bottom, if you can see it, princely manhood, which possibly isn't much in demand today, but who knows. So a list of words there that there's nothing new there. Ever since we've decided to educate our children in schools, well, frankly, ever since families were bringing up children, we've wanted our children to acquire, as well as knowledge of all the subjects that they go to school for, all these other things that you'll see on that book cover. Now, I want to take us into a place that is also exploring some of the psychological elements of character. And there's no better to do this than Lauren Resnick, one of the most preeminent psychologists of our day. And she, I think, very helpfully begins to describe character in terms of the learning habits, the things that we do routinely in our lives. So character can all too often remain an abstract noun, and it's not. In the real world, character is whether or not you figure out a workable solution when you get stuck. It's whether or not you can work with people that you don't necessarily get on with that well. It is, as Lauren Resnick says, in effect, like our intelligence, it's the sum of one's habits of mind, all the things that we do in our daily life. More recently, here in England, there's been some splendid work by the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues in Birmingham. And they offer us a three-dimensional description of what character might be. And you can see that there are three headings, something to do with civic, our role in the broader civic society, something to do with moral, perhaps where many of us might start, some of the words I've been looking at already, and then something that, a phrase called performance character, that's more about that list of things I've just been talking about, and probably more about those things that are top of the mind of teachers when they're thinking about character education. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the moral list aren't important, they're critically important, but they're kind of in the gift of the school. They're the decision that a parent makes when she or he decides which school they're going to send their child to. And as children grow up and become teenagers, they're the kind of values that help teenagers decide who they want to be in, which school they want to be in, and which gangs they want to be part of, and so forth. So moral, very important, civic, very important, but the area I want to focus on more as we go through this conversation is performance character. It's a phrase that grew up in the first decade of this century, and it started its life in America with the Character Education Partnership. Now, just almost close your eyes for a moment. Well, don't, because you'll stop seeing the screen, but if you do close your eyes and just think all the things that you associate with character, and I'll be interested to see whether school is one of them. Because for many of them, it's all those things that you do outside school. It's those exciting but possibly rather demanding experiences you did if you ever went on an expedition without the help of adults. It's the things that you do perhaps when you're helping in the community and there's no other adult around, but you're faced for the first time with an older person, let's say with dementia, and you're trying to work out how you can be kind and helpful to them. But we're talking about schools here, not just the classroom, but everything that goes on in schools. So the co-curriculum and all the things that we can do from school. And you'll remember, in a moment I'm going to come on to the question, can character education be taught? And it's worth remembering that not everything that we want to learn is necessarily taught in a conventional way in school. And I think character is probably one of these ideas. Recently, Guy and I have written directly to parents about this, and we've been astonished at the amount of interest we've had in this. We imagine a girl, let's call her Ruby, who is the granddaughter, and some of you, if you're old enough, will remember the film Educating Rita. She's the fictional granddaughter of Rita, and she's in a school near you. And we imagine whether Ruby is, at the same time as she's learning fantastic science and great arts work and to be a wonderful mathematician and a great writer, she's also working and learning how to gain in confidence, how to keep her curiosity going even when she thinks she's got to close things down because there's a test around the corner, how to collaborate with people in all settings, how to communicate, talking all the time about what's going on for her as she learns, and how to work with others in groups as she communicates that. She's creative, restlessly keen to be different and have ideas in a whole range of different situations. She's committed. She has what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. And she might not necessarily like this word because it's got the word man in it, but she's a craftsman. That's to say, she's somebody who never does less than her best. So she's never in that sort of 24 space of handing in homework that is kind of just good enough. She's always willing to go the extra mile. And we discovered when we were talking to parents that this is, of course, exactly what parents want. Hold that thought for a second, because I want to move on and ask a parallel question now. So if character is a set of things to do with who we are as moral individuals, who we are in society, and how good we are as learners, then does it matter? Well, kind of, I think I've answered the question, but in case you think I haven't, let's try this. I reckon that most of you would agree with these statements, so I'm going to read them out and just, as it were, riff off them. We want young people to develop a strong moral compass. Well, what parent or teacher would not want that? We want kids who know right from wrong. And it's tricky, isn't it? It's tricky in a socially networked world where all of your friends are doing that on Facebook or Instagram or whichever part of the social ether you inhabit, and you kind of feel that may not be right. How do you put that into practice? We certainly want young people who can deal with the tricky, uncertain problems that we're going to face. Think of the issues that we're dealing with right now. Think of migration. Think of a lack of resources in the earth to go round. And of course we want people who are going to be fulfilled, who find their emotional taproot, who are happy in life. And thirdly, unsurprisingly, all of that is important, but we want kids who will do well in exams, whatever exams we can come up with. And interestingly, PISA, the monitor, if you like, of all countries' exams, that tests 15-year-olds in English, maths and science, and who all education ministers are afraid of, invent a different exam every 3 years to test these other things. In 2012, it was about creative thinking, creative problem solving to be precise. In 2015, it was collaborative problem solving. We're now thinking about what it might be in 2018 and 2021. And I'm pretty convinced from what I'm reading and what I'm discovering that it's absolutely going to be in this area of what we might call character. The fourth point here is that, you know what, we want people not just for happy, fulfilled personal lives, but to be productive in their lives. So we want them to be employable. And we want explicitly, don't we, to connect to those things that parents and families say that they value too. So I think on almost any count, it's common sense to suggest that character really matters, as I've defined it. Let's go a little deeper into that, and let's look a bit more at what I'm saying here. It may be an obvious thing to say, but simply by what schools choose to teach and what schools choose to value, they're making a moral statement, aren't they? So you could, if you like, say, you can't not teach character in schools by the way the adults in that space interact with you, by the culture of the place, by who gets rewarded, who's asked to stand up in a school assembly and is praised publicly for their work. Is it just the people who have won things or who've done good things in music and the arts traditionally? Or is it a whole range of other things that might be about really persistent learners who keep going in the face of all difficulty? Or really kind people who that week have gone the extra mile to show some moral courage in their life? Well, recently we've been looking at this from a number of perspectives. Here's a set of words that I think you'll recognize. They're very similar to the ones I started out with. Words like perseverance and trust and self-esteem and openness to experience, an important psychological trait, and empathy. We can't do anything in this world, can we, if we don't have empathy? Because if I don't have empathy, I don't know how you're feeling. And I've got no way of reading what's going on there. By the way, giving a webinar is a very spooky experience because I have no idea what you're thinking of what I'm saying. It's one of the occasions, as in a TV studio, when you just simply have to hope that what you're saying is connecting with you. If it is connecting and you're attached to a Twitter feed, tell us, please. If you've got questions for us, then go to the Expansive Education at eedNET and tell us what you'd like me to come on to in the last part of this webinar. So this set of character skills, watch that word because I'll come back to it, it is the list that James Heckman and colleagues have come up with. James Heckman is no slouch. He is a Nobel laureate, an economist, and he's saying these things aren't just nice to haves in a kind of moral way. These are at the hard edge of things, the things that really matter to society. Here's another set of researchers shining a lens on this area. This is Leslie Gutman and Ingrid Schoen. And they use a different phrase here, one I don't like at all, by the way, non-cognitive skills. I'll come on to that in a moment. But they're in the same kind of zone. And I hope you're also beginning to see what I'm arguing here. It was my third point earlier on, that we want young people to do well in exams. And it turns out that young people who have these characteristics, the kind of things that are on this list, are not only more fun to be around and do better in life, they do better on exams. So what's not to want there? This is, as they say, a classic win-win opportunity for teachers, even those teachers who maybe feel most busy and most beset by things that they need to do in a new syllabus if you're in a primary setting, or fretting about the new Attainment 8, Progress 8, EBAC world that you find yourself if you're in a state school in the secondary world, or if you're in an independent school, or the various things that are being thrown at you at the moment as we think about grammar schools and new responsibilities for the independent sector. Wherever we are, I think we'd agree, young people and children are young people and children. And whatever setting we find ourselves in, we're trying to develop their character and their capabilities. Interestingly, it's not just economists and psychologists and educationalists and families who say that these things matter. As I said earlier on, if we want to prepare young people for the world of work, now this is not just for being employed, by the way, is it? Because many of the young people we work with are going to be going out and starting their own micro businesses. I'd like to think that the university students behind the cameras in the studio at this university will go on and start their own micro business or be part of that kind of scene where you don't necessarily need to wait for your employer to come for you. But look at the characteristics that this is the CBI that they say they would like. Determined young people with grit, resilience, tenacity, self-control, curiosity. Optimistic young people with enthusiasm, zest, gratitude, confidence, ambition, and creativity. And emotionally smart young people who know how to be humble, who have respect and are able to show good manners, and are sensitive to global occasions and global concerns. It's not a bad list, is it? Who would have thought that we would get such an imaginative list from our premier employment group? I'm thrilled with the campaign that they're running, and I think it shows how many different voices are coming together to suggest that what we're talking about here, core and central to the Expansive Education Network, is the kind of thing that parents and employers and teachers and young people all want. So if it's definable, and I've had a go at that and suggested that there are a number of ways you can do that, and if it's wanted and if it's a good thing, here's the key question, isn't it? Can it be taught? And it's a tricky question, isn't it? Because the word taught implies or can imply a sort of one-way street. So let's just think about three words that are like taught but not quite like taught. Can character be taught, or is it learned, or is it cultivated? I'm going to work from the bottom up of that screen. I think character is cultivated, and it's cultivated from the climate and culture that you find yourself in, from all the opportunities that you're given, from the way people treat you, from what, as somebody once said about culture, what the organization does when it thinks nobody's looking. So if it's only kind when it's on parade or when somebody important's visiting, you can be sure that it's not really kind. Is it learned? Well, I think it's definitely learnable, and I think we learn it, and learning's helpful, by the way, I think, because it implies it might be informal, and it's at least as informal as it is formal. Can it be taught? Well, yes, it can. if you take the definition, those learning skills that I was describing, it can be. But I think I'd like to suggest that it's only part of a bigger picture. So yes, it can be taught, but perhaps it's more helpful to think about it as being learned, and more helpful even still to think about it as something that schools cultivate. Now, once you've coped with that flurry of nouns there, just stop and look and think and reflect on the different nuances that each of those words carries with it. I've done some color coding here. It's not very subtle, so words that I have problems with are in red. Words which are kind of halfway houses are in orange. Words which are in black seem absolutely neutral and interesting and helpful. And words which are in green seem to me to go with the grain of the argument that I'm suggesting. These are all words to describe capabilities, aren't they? They're all words to describe these kind of wider aspects of character that I'm talking about, but they each come with different associations. So if you think about an attribute, well, then that's something that could be a moral thing or it could be a learning thing. If you think about a capacity, that's quite widely used like competence in the workplace. And capacity suggests to me sometimes that you have a finite capacity. Maybe that's unhelpful. Capability I've already suggested I like, as I do character. Characteristics sometimes can suggest that it's a sort of painting by numbers activity. Cognitive skill and its close cognitive cousin, non-cognitive skill, I have a big problem with. It implies that cognitive skill, classically doing all the tricky stuff like quadratic equations and working out chemical formulae and notating music and all the kind of so-called academic harder stuff, is one kind of thing we do. And non-cognitive stuff, non-cognitive skill, all these things to do with empathy and getting on well with difficult people and sticking with tricky stuff, that it's non-cognitive implies that it's not as good as or not as countable as. So I think that you're probably only non-cognitive, frankly, when you're dead. And I think it's an unhelpful alternative. So you can see I've coloured that one red. We've got a set of things that are black, the competence C, the cross-functional skill, and then two of my favourites, disposition. Disposition suggests that you not only know how to be kind, you actually are kind in life. You not only know how to come up with good ideas when you need them, but when the chips are down, you can do it in a range of different contexts. And habit of mind, too, comes with that sort of set of meanings. I've talked about non-cognitive skill. Soft skill, oh, please, no. Soft skills are hard. Soft skills are an unfortunate aberration, I think, because they imply that the very things that we're talking about aren't really valuable. And they are. They're hard, and soft skills are hard to acquire. Trait is something that's used in the literature of character quite a lot. I have a problem with that because it's also used as if it were a stick of rock. So a trait is something you might have been born with. And I'm not sure about that. A trait is something that seems a little more fixed, a little less likely to be developable or something that can be cultivated. Transferable skill says what it is, doesn't it? And that's really important. Many of these things are not context specific, or rather, I'm going to reverse that, are context specific, because whilst you can maybe mount a really good argument over the kitchen table with your family, when you have to stand up in front of your mates at school, it's more tricky. Or whilst it's possible to be pretty resourceful in your private life, when the technology fails as a teacher, it's sometimes difficult to stay calm. Transversal skill, I've coloured that black, but it could actually have been red. It's a sort of technocratic word that I never hear any teacher I've ever met use, but is widely used by policymakers. Wider skills, that says what it is. And 21st century skills is my current pet hate because it's lazy, isn't it? Yes, hello, we're in the 21st century, and if the only way we define what skills matter is by the century, then I think we've lost the rigour that this subject determines and demands. So, I'm warming up to answering the question, can you teach, learn, and cultivate character? And my kind of segue into this was to say, well, it kind of depends what you mean by that, and having these varieties of meanings may be helpful. So there are schools, and we're working with some of them, that are doing just this. Here is a wonderful secondary school in South London. Thomas Tallis School. They have reconfigured the way they teach secondary school students under a number of headings which are remarkably close to the kind of things I was showing you, about being inquisitive, collaborative, persistent, disciplined, that's the craftsmanship of Ruby's C's, and imaginative. And I'll tell you more about something else later on, and that is that they are beginning to have a view that you can track the development of these things in young people. Other side of the world. Here is a wonderful school led by a wonderful principal, Chris Causey, in the western hills of Sydney, and she and her staff have gone one stage further. They've not only taken that similar sort of model, whether it's called creativity or a capability wheel or character wheel, I don't really mind, because when you look at it, you'll see we're talking about the same kind of learning habits of mind. She's taken, if you can see it, which is probably tricky, but you can find out more by looking at the Expansive Education Network site. She's taken all the words associated with these, all the thinking routines associated with these, and the kind of learning and teaching methods that staff might use in a staff room to bring these alive. So two schools, two secondary schools, the other side of one in the northern, one in the southern hemisphere, both showing that this is absolutely doable. Here's another school that I was in very recently, taking some of the thinking from Educating Ruby. This is not just a school, it's a chain of schools, and in this example we're in the independent sector. They're day schools, largely but not exclusively in London. And they've started to figure this or have this centrally in the way that they talk about everything in the school. It's impossible not to know that this is what counts round here. So inevitably, once you've got a handle on what this is, if you're a teacher, your mind goes to, so if I were teaching maths or science or geography or art or history or whatever it is you teach, could I teach kids this as well as teaching whatever my subject is? And the answer is yes, you can. And some of the theory behind this is really helpfully articulated by Lee Schulman. And it's the idea of there being a signature pedagogy, a set of teaching and learning methods which make it more likely that you can develop character in a classroom, or in a workshop, or in a studio, or in a dance hall, on a sports field, wherever your location is. And we're going to explore those in a little more depth. Before we do that, I want to take you through a four-stage process of thinking about, before you dive into the classroom, thinking about what might be going on here. So from the work that we've been doing in a number of areas, certainly with the hundreds, now thousands of teachers in the Expansive Education Network and all the wonderful schools across the world undertaking their own inquiries here, we're beginning to understand that there are four and a half, if you like, because three has two components to it, four elements of what we're talking about. The first is that you really have to understand it. If you're talking about resilience, it's no good just talking vaguely about resilience. You've got to have an idea of what it might look like in a maths classroom, if you're 7, to be resilient when you get stuck with a tricky maths puzzle. If you're talking about being able to persevere and collaborate, you've got to have an idea perhaps what it looks like when you're, as a sixth former, undertaking a tricky biology experiment with a group and you're about to be assessed. And the same would go if you were in a non-formal setting outside a classroom. You've really got to understand what it boils down to, and there are lots of places where you can go to find out more. The second thing, and if you haven't got the sense of where I've been going, I think the most important thing is that everything, the climate, the culture of the school, has to make it really easy for this to be the kind of thing that is valued. So there have to be plenty of teachers who are role models for what we're talking about. So if we want teachers who are curious, then we want teachers who are not only going to answer their own questions or ask questions to which they, because they're skilled people, know the answers to. We want teachers who are going to ask young people questions where they don't know the answers and are going to make it possible for young people to explore that. If you really want to develop these kind of things, then, for example, your whole approach to the way you display work around the school will change. It will start to involve you in thinking about the process. So you're going to show work in progress. You're going to show prototypes. You're going to show annotated poems rather than just the final thing, and so forth. By the way, you're reporting to parents everything you do, the way you reward young people, that's going to change too. Because we need to get you into a world, and I'm now moving into 3 and 4, or if you like 3.1 and 3.2, or 3A and 3B. We need to choose the kinds of teaching and learning methods that are going to be likely to help children become resilient, for example. If I were, in an imaginary nightmare world, simply to sit people in rows and say, I want you to become resilient, now open your textbook at page 35, you tell me whether they're going to be resilient. Or if, as some of our teachers have recently been exploring, you want to find different ways of encouraging perseverance in maths. And so you ask yourself the question, if I stop answering my 8-year-old mathematician's questions, will they become better at solving them themselves? Hey presto, you're onto a teaching method that's more likely to help your children to develop the perseverance they're going to need to get on in life. So pedagogies, I'm going to come on to that in more detail in a minute. And 3.2 or 3B, if you like, split screen. So yes, you can teach empathy and a subject. Here's an example. You could teach the causes of the First World War at the same time as you teach empathy for the extraordinary, terrible situation that those young men must have been in the trenches. If you were trying to teach at the same time as history, approach appropriate skepticism for the kind of claims that people make, especially if they've just won the war. You could definitely do that through the medium of history. And if you were doing that, you might find yourself saying at the beginning of the lesson, today we're going to be studying the First World War, and I'm hoping that one of the outcomes will be is that you're better able to come to your own view about some of the causal factors of that. In other words, at the same time, we're really going to be looking at knowledge claims and how we value evidence. Can you see what I'm doing? You've got both worlds, the kind of traditional part of history and something that might be more about taking the decisions that would help you in terms of character. And finally, of course, because schools are ultimately about young people, aren't they? If we think this is important, we've got to flood the system with opportunities for young people to show leadership in this area. And that will as much be outside the classroom as it will be inside the classroom. So all the other things that young people do, the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme they're part of, the homes that they visit, the help that they offer, the basic banks that they support, the mentoring that they do with younger children in the local primary school, that's where they're going to build this, isn't it? The clubs that they lead, the connections that they make, the encouragement that they give to local sports group, local arts group, parents, employers groups, not-for-profits to come and be part of the school experience. So can you see where I'm going with this? It can be taught. I gave you a specific example in history, but I could have given you an example from almost any other subject. And my colleague Guy Claxton's Building Learning Power, I think, is the best worked up example, along with Habits of Mind, the Habits of Mind initiative in the States, of how you can do this in practice. There are plenty of schools that are doing this day in, day out. It's the norm. It's not new. It's not some new idea. It's just what they do very well. I want to come on to now a little bit more granular approaches to how you might do it. And here are some methods that are currently being explored and used in Melbourne. So the state of Victoria is an extraordinary one. It's wonderful and beautiful. I'm a fan of it. And I work there regularly with the Mitchell Institute. And we've been answering, or trying to answer, a really tricky question, which is, Australia, by the way, has a curriculum which is half based on character and half based on disciplinary knowledge. Character, as described in the Australian curriculum, is called capabilities. So partly curriculum in the way that you'd understand it, history and maths and science and all the rest of it, and partly capabilities, like critical thinking and creative thinking, for example, or ethical understanding, for example. So we've been working with some wonderful schools trying to figure out, so how do you teach this then? And we've also been answering a trickier question, how could we assess this? I'll come on to that later on, because before this webinar we had a number of questions, and one of them that really piqued my interest was, can you assess character? And I'm going to have a go at answering that question in a few moments. So here are some examples of schools across the world that we're trying out in the state of Victoria, and we're using to see whether they work well. Our hypothesis is, if you like, our theory of change here, is that if we're trying to develop young men and women who have both the traditional skills and knowledge that they need to do well in exams, and also the kind of capabilities that we want them to have, the character, then we're most likely to do it through these kinds of approaches. We're much less likely to do it through the kind of rather silly example I gave you earlier on, because no longer does anybody, in that parody of a classroom that I offered you, no one asks children passively to sit in rows. That is a myth. It's a myth unhelpfully put about. Most teachers do most of this or some of this most of the time. So something else to be on our guard for is that this is not new. All I would say is that this is quite an interesting mix of methods, and for many this palette from which we can paint is a little more colourful than perhaps we might currently be familiar with. So my suggestion, if you're watching this and not familiar with these kind of methods, would be to say, go find out, go try it out. Come and join us at the Expansive Education Network and do that rigorously and undertake your own small steps of change. So a little while back when we were announcing the first of our webinars, we invited people to tell us what else they'd like us to talk about. And straight back came this great question: can it be assessed? So it's tricky, isn't it? And let's just get rid of some myths that might sit around this too. I think if we simply reduce character to level 3B, you know, she was very creative, was Ruby. She got a 3B. I think we probably, well, we seem ridiculous, don't we? And if we're dealing with things that are also quite close to our humanity, like our kindness or our values, to somehow score that may equally be unhelpful, mayn't it? So how could we think more creatively about this? Well, what I'm going to offer you now is not the answer. It's some promising practices. It's some work in progress, and I'm going to hope that it connects with you in your school or your university or wherever you're watching this, or perhaps you're at home. Praise be if you are by now. So here's back to Thomas Tallis School. Thomas Tallis School, this is just one of many great examples of what they're doing at the moment. This is an app. All the kids have access to it, and the app allows you very, very simply to scan and upload to your portfolio examples of work that might be illustrative of your progress in one of their capabilities. And their capabilities, you will remember, we're very thrilled, draw on our work, but they could be drawing on anybody's work. Here's another example. This is an even more high-tech one. This is the world, welcome to the world of open badges. So if you were ever a scout or a guide, you might remember that badge that mum or dad sewed on your, I say mum or dad, it quite often was mum, or maybe it was you, sewed on your uniform, and it showed that you could do something, didn't it? And hopefully it mattered. It gave you a little kind of frisson of pride to think that you'd achieved something. Well, this is the exact same equivalent, except that it's digital. So that when you show up to an employer, or when you're talking about, you know what, I think I've got, so I've made some real progress in perseverance, then you could open up your electronic portfolio and you could see some examples, some little film clips or a testimonial or whatever it was, or a piece of work that had gone through 5 different iterations. That's exciting, isn't it? And I think that's the world that we're in as we think about how we can assess this. Back to my friends in Victoria. This is Sharon Foster, my colleague at the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority. And here we're working with a group of principals and teachers from right across the spectrum, and we're looking at, as Sharon is speaking in that slide, we're looking at some online materials which they've developed, which enable children to go into an online world and playfully explore and learn at the same time as being given feedback on how well they're doing in any one of these areas. This, I think, this one was a number puzzle, and there's an example of a forensic mystery in a home, and they're all very deep and engaging pieces of learning. If you wanted to think more formally about this, then I think you can think about different ways of doing this. You can think of the kind of things that the children could do and the kind of ideas that teachers might like, and then you can bring other adults in, and then you can think of the kind of external tests that I gave you an example of in Australia, or the PISA recent collaborative problem solving was all online. So there's proof of concept there. Let's just pick a few examples from the pupil list there. So the simplest way of knowing whether you're making progress is to turn to your neighbour, isn't it? And say, hey, here's what I think I can do. Do you think I'm making progress? And that's called real-time feedback, isn't it? Or you can formalize that too by encouraging young people at every lesson to do that. Or you might want to come up with photographic evidence. Very easy with institutions that allow the use of your own technology, but even with a tablet in the class, you can do that. All sorts of ways in which you can make records, little questionnaires or self-reports. You might keep a simple log or diary. You might ask your fellow students to review your own work, and so forth. And I've mentioned digital badges and portfolios. When it comes to the teacher, of course, back to the first of those 4 or 5 core principles, you really need to understand what it is you're looking for, don't you? So the in-process evaluation needs to be criterion referenced. So if we're going to offer any grade, however general, we've got to know what progress might look like. Or we might set a rich performance task. I don't mean a silly, narrow task. I mean a really complex piece of group work that requires you to play a lot of roles. We might have the artifacts of what you do, and this can work very well in practical subjects where you're looking at an end product and you're saying, yeah, I'm an expert in this and I can see the work that's gone into making that pot or that piece of music or that dance. Not just the arts, though. It works well in engineering. In fact, capstone projects come from the world of engineering. Complex, deep, interrelated, extended projects. Or we might want to make the whole thing more authentic. I'm very much a fan of the work of Ron Berger in the Expeditionary Schools movement, who's shown how authentic real-world engagement with people who are expert is a really terrific way of raising the bar, of raising the performance of young people. And how those are just some of the ways in which you might present your work. Funnily enough, when you go into the workplace, you will not have to sit down on a June afternoon and write without talking with a pencil on a piece of paper for 2 hours. That doesn't exist in the workplace. You're much more likely to be asked to have been part of an experience and then create a short podcast for it or make a short film about it. And that's the way in this digital world things are going. Gallery critique is one of Ron Berger's very nice ideas of taking the idea of work in progress so that students might be critiquing each other's work. At the heart of assessment is assessment for learning. And that means giving and receiving feedback. If we can't do that, we can't learn, I believe. And finally, we can get into that world of reliable, validated external tests. So I reckon that most of us do some of that, don't we? I'd love you to be thinking now as you're watching this, so what am I doing there already? Tick. And I'd love you to be thinking, secondly, what do I think I could do that I'm not doing now? Question mark. I might give that a go. And when I see a word that I don't know, maybe a double question mark. I'd like to go and find out about that. After this session, I'll go and ask somebody else. In the example I gave you earlier on, we've spent a lot of time, this is the Thomas Tallis model that we developed a little while back for the OECD, thinking very carefully about what it would be like to be fully creative. And actually, when you look at those, they're remarkably similar, aren't they, to the list of things I was showing you from a number of the thinkers in the first part of this talk. That's not accidental, because, of course, remember, I was talking about learning capabilities. You might be interested to know that the OECD is now with 14 countries and a lot of students and a lot of teachers trying to figure out how best we can teach this and how best we can assess it. So the OECD thinks this might just be doable, and the early results from this project, it's into its second year of 3, suggest that it is possible. I'm very privileged and proud to be part of this project. So I'm about to draw breath for the formal part of this session, and I'm about to turn to a question that we've had and others that are coming in now. But just whilst I do that, in fact, I'm going to turn to my colleague who's out of screen here, Naomi, and ask her to pass me anything that we've got on the Twitter feed here. Thank you very much. So we've got a number of questions here. Thank you. But before I do that, let me just remind you that there's a website. There's a number of really helpful resources. In fact, if I could just get my colleagues to put the screen back up, thank you. And there's a site that Ruby has that's all her own when you can go and play and find out what might be. If you want a conversation with me, there are 3 ways in which you could engage with me. So let's turn now to the kind of things that we're getting from our Twitter feed. We're getting an example of design and technology, and he's saying how in design and technology this is absolutely the way that we function, that problem-based learning is absolutely at the heart of what we do as technologists, and is a really excellent example of how we might encourage this kind of thing in young people. Thank you, and that's from a technologist. Another example here of an idea. Here's a suggestion that we need to create the environment for people to develop character and also to recognize it as a learning need. I think one of the things that I hope has become clear as I've been talking is that this is 90% about the climate and only a relatively small part about the specifics about what we're doing. So I completely agree with that comment. We absolutely need to create the climate. In the business world at the moment, it's widely said that culture trumps strategy for breakfast. And if I were to translate that in the learning environment, culture trumps curriculum. So we used to call it the hidden curriculum. And there's another very relevant theory here called theory in use and espoused theory, Chris Argyris' idea that what we really do, our theory in use, is what young people really notice. That's the climate, that's the culture, that's the reality of being in a school near you. What it's really like on a Monday afternoon. Espoused theory is what we say on the website. It's what we say in assemblies that we sometimes do. And young people are very, very adept at finding out the kind of appearance reality, the gap between what we say we do and what we really do. And the great schools that are doing this are doing just that. They're really taking great care to make sure that the lived reality is just that. So what they say they do, they really do. I think one idea that this questioner leads me on to is to suggest that in terms of the reward schemes, it may be that just as we have a sort of effort and attainment way of marking or scoring classical progress in disciplinary areas like maths and science, we may need a different one for character. It may be that we need, and I was in a school only yesterday, we need these characters or characteristics very clearly described. The school I was in had a postcard for each one, and on that was the name and was an exemplification of it and was a saying that might be associated with it. And we need these to be as much on the classroom walls as are our times tables, as are our reminders that we might be doing this if we're if we're learning our phonics and we're learning how to read, that we need to have this kind of level of immediate opportunity available to kids and teachers on the classroom wall. So right at the kind of chalk face, if you like, or the whiteboard face, we need this. We need it in the reward system too. So it would be lovely to think, wouldn't it, that those schools, often secondary schools, have a sort of homework diary, and they have in it all sorts of places where you can put your merits, or maybe that's electronically done. It seems to me logical that we need a split-screen world in which the same attention is paid to the kind of progress that you might show in the development of character. Now, you've been very patient. We've been about the 50 minutes that we said we were going to be on this. I'm just going to pause for a second and look just for a second to see if there's anybody else wanting to ask us anything at all. Otherwise, I'll just conclude in a moment with some remarks to take us forward. I'm going to seize the moment and conclude. So, first, thank you so much for listening to us. We love your feedback. It's our first, and let us model what we have been talking about. And we know very well we can do it better. And please tell us how we can do it better. Please tell us what you're doing in the area of the development of character and capability in the young people and children that you teach. Secondly, if you have resources or ideas or practical suggestions, do please share them with us. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to showcase those on the Expansive Education Network. If you're a school that's been doing this for some while, we'd love to tell your story. We think that teachers, busy teachers like you, are often well moved, well persuaded by other colleagues sharing their experiences. Not preachy, but sharey. And that's what the Expansive Education Network tries to do. And finally, and this is a request for just some of you, or an opportunity for some of you, if you like what you've seen, then come and play with us on the Expansive Education Network. Come and consider what you might like to do as a small test of change yourself as a teacher. Maybe you can think already how your history lesson might be a little different, or how you might teach your English students to draft their GCSE essays even more effectively so that they keep going even better. Or maybe you're just thinking, you know what, this is sort of common sense. This isn't progressive or different or odd, or this isn't something that somebody's telling me to do. You can't not teach character education. And I do teach it. I teach it pretty well, but I'm passionately interested in this subject, and I'd love to find out more. Thank you very much for listening and watching.